Well, it's a beautiful spring morning, and I thought it's a great opportunity just to talk you through little watering tips. As you can see, I've filled up my watering can from my water butt there. You'll notice there's no downpipe into this water butt because this water butt in the garden will just fill up from buckets and containers we leave her out when it rains. You can also have them coming off downpipes off the house or off the shed. And water butts are a great way of keeping your water in the garden. You can have a nice lid on so that you're not getting all pests and bugs in there. And also they can warm up slightly, which is kind of what you want. You don't want it to be scorching hot. And that brings me on to my first watering tip is before you water, particularly in the spring months, when it's been very cold overnight, you want to check the temperature of your water, whether you're using a can or a hose. And the easiest way to do that is either you can use your wrist or the back of your hand and just pour the water over. And that's just about acceptable to me. If I was pouring the water over and I was like, oh, that's freezing, that's the plant's going to have that same reaction. So you don't want that. And the same if it's too hot. If you nearly scald yourself, you don't want to be putting that onto plants. But that's just about right. And that goes the same for if you're using a hose as well. Bearing in mind there could be cold water in that hose. If you're running from the tank in the house, the water could still be quite cold up in the tank. So that's a good tip there. If you're worried at all, what I quite often do is I'll fill some watering cans the night before, and I'll place them in the spot that gets the sun first in the morning, so that then heats them up. Now there's two ways you can approach it. You can either water in the morning or in the evening. A lot of people favour the evening because particularly in the summer months you can water that plant and it just essentially they're not sitting dry overnight. They've got something to work all the mechanisms within the plant. However, I don't like plants, particularly when it's very cold nights below, say 8 degrees, to be sitting in cold roots, in wet roots. So what I like to do is water in sort of mid-morning, before the sun gets properly up. And first thing I would say is most watering cans come with one of these, which is called a rose. And you get different holes in them, depending on what you want to water. And I always think the smaller holes you can get, the better. Because to be honest with you, most of the time you don't really want to be using this. It's only really for things like seedlings. So we can just pop that onto our can there, because we don't want to use that. It's not going on the end. So here I have a rosemary plant that I've just recently potted up and cut back. And it's sort of just in this corner, really as a bit of shelter, but also it gets a lot of sun, and also because I'm moving the garden around a lot. How do I know whether it needs watering or not? Well, the easiest way to check with most things is actually on the weight, and this is how most of the trade and nurserymen do it. And all you're doing is with a big pot like this, you're just feeling the weight by lifting a corner. And you might be able to see here, I've got some little pot feet, which is just lifting it off the slab that it's sitting on. And that feels quite heavy, so it might not need much water. Also, I've covered this with some grit, and the grit is to hold the moisture. It's acting like a mulch. And as you can see here, when I actually look at the compost itself, it's damp. So I don't need to do anything with this one, because that's perfect. It felt heavy when I scraped away the surface. It's still wet underneath. I could use a trusty moisture sensor, which is my finger, and just dig that in. And if I get that right down past my knuckle and it's still wet down there, then that's fine. Say it did. How do we water it if it was such a big pot that we couldn't even lift it to check the weight? Well, good thing is this is on pot feet, so we can physically see the water drain through nicely. And what we would do is we would just water it a bit, water it a bit, water it a bit, you know, so you're doing a few pots and you'll keep coming back. And what you want to see is the water start dribbling out the bottom of the pot. And that's your gauge with a large pot that the water has penetrated through and it's had enough water. What you don't want to do is empty a whole can at once, because if it's got too dry, that compost, the water becomes what they call hydrophobic. It hates the water. So you want to be introducing a bit of water, so it gradually soaks it up, and then you can gauge. If something gets very hydrophobic, what you might have to do is apply a bit of water and then come back, and then later, a few hours or in the evening or the next day, water again. So again, same trick, but these I can actually lift right up. I'm just seeing about the weight, and that seems a little bit on the light side. I'm just going through. Now, interestingly, although it's a different plant altogether, the ones which I've put my mulch over, my grit on, are still very wet, so they're absolutely fine. I don't need to do anything to those. But these fuchsias here that have had the compost exposed, they could do with a little drop of water, although when I stick my special moisture sensor down, there is still, I can still feel a bit of dampness in there. Let's go through. Okay, yeah, and they'll need watering. So how can you tell by the weight? Well, it's quite simple actually. So I have my watering can here. Notice no rows in the end. And just gently applying the water. And if you're thinking, well, my plants are in a flower bed, don't worry, we're going to get to that in a second. There we go. And it's, as you can see, it's essentially a little bit at a time with a lot of these plants. While I'm waiting for the water level to go down in that other one, I'm just applying some water to other plants. And then if I feel like it needs more, I can then come back and put more on. But that's perfect. As you noticed, I'm using some grow bag trays here in this area just to capture all the water that's drained off. They can then either soak it back up, or I can drain off that water in the grow bag trays to put back into my water butt or into a watering can. Now that that's thoroughly watered through, I'm happy that it's soaking wet. I can feel the weight, and that helps me start to judge what a fully watered one should feel like weight-wise, so that when I come back, whether it be tomorrow or a week's time, I know what the dry weight will be like and what the wet weight will be like. It is a bit of an art getting used to that, but that's essentially what you do there. Another way is to water from below. So obviously you could have them in something like this grow bag tray, and as I was mentioning, you just fill up the tray and let the plants soak up what they want. And because these grow bag trays here have a little ridge in there, there's plenty of space to get underneath the pot and for it to soak up through the holes in the pot. So, got these lilies here in a bed. Let's pull that weed, and it's quite dry. Now all I'm going to do is I am going to just water around the plant. So you're always watering the soil or the compost, not the plant, because essentially that water can act like a magnifying glass when the sun hits it, which is why you either want to water ideally in the morning, early to mid-morning, depending on the temperatures, or in the evening. again, dependent on the temperatures. So I've let a little bit of water in there. I just let that soak in and go and water a bit more. And then what I come back and do is I just, again, my special moisture monitor, stick my finger in and see how far that water's penetrated. You want it really to be penetrating through the roots. So here we have a plant that is really dry, really hydrophobic. So the way to solve this is first we check the temperature. Oh, just about right. And then what we do is we place it into the water and we dunk it down. This one, you can see all the bubbles coming out. And what we're waiting is for the bubbles to stop. It's getting a little bit cold. That's okay. And there we go. And then we just let that drain off. And that's good. And this little device here is a pH and moisture meter. Now I've got it set on the moisture setting, so I flick the switch right away across there. If I wanted to know what the pH was, I could flick it across there and you see the counter's changed there. Now for the pH meter to work properly, I advise doing it, say, maybe half hour after watering, because it needs some moisture to read the pH reasonably accurately. But you can see our pH here is 7. But anyway, let's get back to the moisture. So here we go. So you can see I did this in the bucket dunking about 2 hours ago, and so it's lovely and wet. It's in that range there. And just here, I've got this in a sack here, which I'm growing my potatoes in. And you can see I've cleaned it off, and my moisture meter is saying that it's sort of moist, just starting to get dry, which makes sense because the surface is dry on this compost, but when you tease it a bit, there is actually a bit of moisture there. So we covered very quickly a few things there, and there's lots of things I haven't covered, like hanging baskets, although you can just treat them like a pot. Haven't covered indoor plants, but again, there are separate videos on the www.gardeningin.org website. It's gardeningin.org, which will give you further guides to watering. You can also investigate further on the internet, but just be really careful, use reliable sources for that. Also, you know, you can again ask the forums on things like Facebook, so the Gardening In Facebook page, or things like Gardening In Seaford, one of our groups, and you can ask. And what I would do is not necessarily take the first answer you get, make a judgment of the answers you get and see what you think sounds right, because the best thing about gardening is everyone has a different opinion on things. So you be a student, not a disciple. You decide what you think's right for you. Now I'm just going to go and finish off my watering now, and I'm wishing you a blooming good spring.